This is David Kurtz for TPM Media. We're here with Liaquat Ahamed, author of the recently released Lords of Finance, The Bankers Who Broke the World, a particular story from the Great Depression era. Mr. Ahamed has also been with the World Bank and has made his career as an investment manager. Now, you go through a story of three central bankers from the Depression era and map out the collapse of the world economy at that time, you argue not starting with primarily the 1929 collapse of Wall Street, but you argue that that's not necessarily what ultimately landed at least the U.S. in the Great Depression itself. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, basically I argue that, first of all, the Great Depression, in fact, started in Germany in 1928. And that was when U.S. lending abroad suddenly stopped, and Germany, which was totally dependent on U.S. capital, plunged into a recession. Then you had the Great Crash in 29, which then hammered the U.S. Then the third element was the banking crisis that began in the U.S. at the end of 1930 when they allowed the banks to go under. And then the final nail in the coffin was the European financial crisis in the summer of 1931, which started with a bank called Creditanstalt, which was the largest bank in Austria, a tiny economy, but it provoked financial panic throughout Europe and basically brought down the whole European financial system.
One of the points that you make is that it was not in and of itself the underlying economic events that necessarily triggered the deeper depression, but a series of responses to those events by Western governments, particularly England and the United States.
We are currently 16 months into the current recession. If you looked at where they were 16 months into the Great Depression, they weren't actually too far away from here. The stock market had gone down about 50-60%. Industrial production was down somewhere between 10 and 20%. Profits were down by about a half. Then what happened was the world economy proceeded to crater. So if you took a snapshot of where we were in the beginning of 1931, we were where we are now, and the world economy began to crater, largely because they applied the wrong medicine to a sick patient, and the medicine they applied killed the patient.
Do you think that we are responding with similar bad medicine or treating the wrong ill, as it were?
No. The virtue of the Great Depression is we know now what not to do. I think we're applying all the right medicines. I think the question now is more whether we're applying them in the right doses. And I think there are a lot of people who would argue that we're not.
One of the things I wanted to hone in on specifically was our current reaction to the banking crisis. I mean, separate and aside a bit from the particulars of the subprime meltdown and from the larger recession, I mean, there's a good deal of discussion now on whether or not some of the larger banks that appear insolvent or which may be found to be insolvent, at least as a result of the stress test that is currently underway, may need to be essentially closed, taken over temporarily by the government, and then resold with the bad assets removed. Is that the sort of higher dosage medicine that you're talking about that we really need to prevent a broader collapse of the banking industry?
It is clear that the banking system as a whole has lost an enormous amount of its equity. That means that some banks are clearly insolvent. And there are only three potential sources of capital. One is to basically put them into some sort of Chapter 11 type thing and really get the capital, recapitalize them by taking the money from bondholders. So that's one possibility. The second is somehow to get private investors to do it. And the third is to put public money in. It seems to me that we are unlikely to be able to get through this without a massive injection of public money, even if we do some of the other two elements. And when I say a massive injection of public money, I'm talking about something like over $1 trillion. In addition, to the 300-400 billion that we've already put in. Past experience with countries that have gone through banking crises suggests that these things cost anywhere from 10 to 15% of GDP in terms of public money, which in our case would be $1.5 to $2.5 trillion. So I believe we'll need $1 trillion in public money. The problem is that is going to be, in the current climate, politically impossible. That doesn't mean they can't do it eventually, but at the moment, if they went up in front of Congress and asked for $1 trillion in money, they'd be thrown out.
At what point in the current crisis did you start to see parallels between now and the 1920s, 1930s?
I think probably in the fall. When look, we knew we had a financial crisis earlier than the fall. After Bear Stearns went under, it was clear that there was some strains in what was known as the shadow banking system. It was really the collapse of Lehman in September, and that terrible week, that 6 or 7 days in September, where one bank after another fell, each day, and had to be rescued, that it was clear that we were dealing with something that paralleled the financial crisis of the Great Depression.
The awareness dawning on people that things are as bad as they are has been slow to come. Did you find a similar sort of delayed reaction just in terms of consciousness amongst people in the 20s and 30s?
Oh, yeah. Look, no one, even the most sort of dire Cassandras, did not predict that as a consequence of subprime loans and a few other bad loans, that the U.S. financial system would come down like a house of cards. So no one predicted that. So that was the first thing no one predicted. People said it was going to be bad, but no one predicted that the whole thing was going to collapse. Secondly, even when the house of cards started tumbling, few people could forecast the impact on the U.S. economy.
Is it overblown to say that things are as bad now as they were then?
Things are definitely not as bad. I mean, the world is different. We have a whole lot of safety nets which prevent things from getting as bad. GDP was down in the Great Depression in the U.S. about 25%, or 30% below trend. I suspect we will end up being about 10% below trend before this thing bottoms out in the U.S. Secondly, unemployment went from 4 to 25%. I suspect unemployment will go this time from 4 to 11 or 12%. Last time, profits fell from 9% of GDP to 0. I think this time profits will fall from 9% to 4% of GDP. So we're really getting something like somewhere between a third, let's say a third of a Great Depression. There are two things I think that keep me up at night. One is that the financial system is that much larger. In the Great Depression, the banking system collapsed. When it collapsed, it was 50% of GDP. Now, the banking system and the shadow banking system in the U.S. is 150% of GDP. In the UK, it's 400% of GDP. In Iceland, it was 900% of GDP. So we've created this financial system, which is a little bit of it's a little bit like Frankenstein, that we're not sure that we can control it. The second element is that we got into the Great Depression because we didn't understand how the economies worked, and we applied the wrong medicine. I think we understand now. The risk is that we get into a depression or an economic cataclysm of some sort out of a failure of political will. And by that I mean that bailing out the banking system just becomes so politically unpalatable that we don't end up doing it. That in Europe, we get a fault line in Eastern Europe where Eastern European countries start defaulting. Western countries, in order to prevent sort of a contagion effect, would need to bail out Eastern European countries, and it gets hard to persuade German and French taxpayers, who've been very prudent and are very thrifty, that they should not to persuade them to bail out Austrian banks and foolhardy Hungarian homeowners. I mean, that's where the problem might arise.
Thank you for sharing your nightmare scenarios with us. We've been talking with Liaquat Ahamed, who's the author of Lords of Finance, The Bankers Who Broke the World, which is available at a bookstore near you. And we appreciate you for your time. This is David Kurtz for TPM Media. We'll talk to you next time.